In chapter 5, what we're trying to do here is trying to, I guess, a bit more understand what is it that we're going to do with the key insight from chapter 4. The key insight being that if I have a two good space here with my quantity of x and my quantity of y, with an indifference curve looking like this, where the utility is constant along the curve, a budget constraint here where I've got a point of optimality where the slope of my indifference curve is equal to the slope of my budget constraint. Well, then the question is what do we do with this, right? And what we're going to do is we want to understand how this leads to, this is just good x here. How does this lead to my demand curve? Which should look a little bit better than that. Okay, so that's where we're going to go here. Well, one of the, I'm not even sure why they do it this way. It's just a bad, it's a bad way to do it. I don't agree with it. Let's see what I can all fit in here. Okay, so notice here that the price of the good on the x-axis here, beer. I don't know why they use beer. It makes him, the author, I think, seem cooler than he really is. It's going from 12 to 6 to 4. Okay, so 12 to 6 to 4. And along these curves, the income is constant. The price of wine is constant. What we can see is that I'm going from a quantity of 26.7 to 44.5 to 48.9. And if I connect the dots, there's my demand curve. That is graphically how the demand curve is derived. Why would they take out the beauty of doing the drop-down graph and instead putting it side to side? Dude, that's just, why would you do that? So all I did there is took the graph on the right-hand side and just transposed it below the graph on the left-hand side so that you can actually see here that based on what we learned in chapter 4, that just making beer cheaper would pivot the budget constraint outwards, keeping the same y-intercept but pivoted outwards so that the x-intercept became larger and larger. But now what we also see is true is that all points on the demand curve are optimal. All those points in the demand curve are optimal in terms of the indifference curve and budget constraint space. And that's what we see right here. Is that the demand curve itself is derived from our indifference curve budget constraint, which we could alternatively call our price consumption curve. And we again see that kind of optimal interaction here as it starts pivoting out, that each of these points are optimal and represent a point where the MRS is equal to the MRT. And so that what you could then do is that you could look at how things change a little bit more when you're looking at your perfect substitute goods. If you have Coke and Pepsi that are perfect substitutes, and I give you a price of the two goods as well as a budget, that what you would find is that the optimal point becomes a corner solution here or here. But again, that's not really doing as much for us here in understanding the overall um, chapter here. But what it does is it creates a demand curve where um, the demand curve looks a little bit different than what we're accustomed to. And again, the reason for that would be because we have some corner solutions existing over here. But the other thing that we can create that is useful, especially if you're involved in marketing or just on the business aspect of things, is that you can create what's called an Engel curve. And what the Engel curve does is it shows us how the quantity demanded changes as the income changes. What that would do is it would help me identify whether my good is normal or inferior, or even the extreme inferior good, known as the Giffen good. I want to stop you from a bad habit. I don't know why. I've never understood why everyone gets super excited about identifying Giffen goods. Let me talk about the history of it a little bit and then hope that by telling you a boring history, you'll find it so boring you'll never want to look at it again. The very first Principles book, Principles of Economics book, was written in 1896. And in that textbook, the author, Marshall, was basically summarizing microeconomic theory as it existed at that point. And he talked about the normal good being one where people buy more of a stuff as their income goes up, less of it as their income goes down. The inferior good, where the opposite happens, income goes up and consumption goes down. Things like store branded food or bus trips, but you don't ride the bus more as your income goes up. You buy a car, right? And then the Giffen good was described by Marshall as there being an economist. His name was Robert Giffen, Sir Robert Giffen. And what he had done is he was an economist who had done some research on the um, Irish potato famine. And what he had found was that income went down and people bought, was that income went down, prices went up, but people bought more. That would mean that if prices are going up and people are buying more, that the Giffen good was so extreme, so inferior, that people bought, that the demand curve would be upward sloping. Now that's really extreme, right? You've probably not seen an upward sloping demand curve. Last time you saw one was when you made mistakes in your 130 or 131 class. It turns out that Giffen was wrong. What he forgot to account for was a very basic fact that the Irish potato consumer was also a producer, right? They were farmers. So their income was actually going up, even though the prices were going up. So it turned out to not work out well as an application. Economists have just been, people devoted their entire careers to trying to find Giffen goods. It's just, and so even if you just go into economics literature, the best case we've got is like a particular grain of rice in China. Someone wrote an article about that in like 2009. You see other examples, 1991, in an American Economic Review article. I get my very simple response to all that is who cares? The Giffen good, regardless, is rather extreme. So, what would be the intellectual value to spending so much time on looking for a Giffen good? I don't know what it is. I hope I've convinced you enough to not look it up. But I am certain that there's someone that's looking up Giffen good right now and reading research and trying to think of something. But I will discourage you greatly. But the Giffen good is basically just a really, really, really inferior good. We have very few instances, if any, of it actually existing. So what the angle curve does here is what we see here is that the budget constraint is shifting out as the income goes up. So as my income is going up, my budget constraint is shifting out, creating a new optimal point and a new optimal point. It creates for us on this space what would be called an income consumption curve. But then if I change my y-axis from the other good to income, I've now got my angle curve, which describes to me that for various levels of income for a household, what do people buy? Obviously, if I were the one selling beer, that would be important, right? Because now I would want to be able to map out where do I distribute my beer to, right? What kind of beer do I distribute to different kinds of households based on their income levels? And so this is then kind of our managerial um, extension here, right? That if Madhu has these two perfect substitute goods, Coke and Pepsi, and we know what his budget looks like, we should be able to graph out what his angle curve looks like, which we can do here. Now, again, here, again, our difference curves are linear because Coke and Pepsi are perfect substitutes. It creates a bunch of corner solutions. It's extreme, and so I'm not entirely sure, to be honest, why the authors are focusing on this because it is pretty extreme. But now, in terms of what can we do with this, um, if especially if we're in marketing and we're starting to look at these applications, the one thing that I'm probably going to want to do is I'm going to want to calculate elasticities. And one of them I'm going to want to calculate is the income elasticity. And in the case of the income elasticity, which we already looked at in previous chapters, right? Change in Y standing for change in income. Change in the quantity of X. Then my income elasticity is going to be my percentage change in the quantity of good X over the percentage change um, in my income. Now, times, sorry, I shouldn't have, wait, let me fix one more thing here. I'm get ahead of myself here, sorry. Our delta Q subscript X, delta Y then our amount of income over our quantity of X, which then leads to my my percentage changes. So in this case, I'm looking at my percentage change in the percentage change in the quantity of good X over my percentage change in income. Which we can just see here in this very simple example. They're just putting a 1 in the denominator and then a 3 in the numerator. That symbol, it's just a Greek symbol that they're using for income elasticity. You don't have to use that one, you use whatever you want. But what the income elasticity can tell us by virtue of its sign, if it's positive or negative, is whether we're dealing with a normal good or an inferior good. When it's positive, then we know that we're dealing with a normal good. And when it's negative, we know that we're dealing with a when it's negative, we know that we're dealing with a inferior good. And if we go back to this XY space, what we can do is we can look at that price consumption curve, or in this case, the income consumption curve, and the direction that our income consumption curve goes tells us which of these two goods are normal goods, inferior goods, or a combination of the two. In this case, if both the good on the x-axis and y-axis are both normal goods, then my income consumption curve will be going somewhere in this space here. If the good on the y-axis is inferior, then it's going to be below, pivot downwards. And if the good on the x-axis is inferior, then it pivots upwards. Again, useful information if you're marketing this product or you're working on the distribution side, because again, you might have external information, right, that we're in a recession, that people are losing their jobs, or that people are being hired. And that's going to then determine, it's going to help you predict what your demand patterns are going to be based on your good either being a normal good or an inferior good. And we can also see that sometimes we can face a situation where the angle curve can bend backwards. Now this happens because we can imagine that you hit a certain income point and the good goes from being normal to inferior. Dealing with this becomes important also from a marketing standpoint, right? Like, do I want my product to be like a luxury good? Do I want it to be accessible to everyone? In this case, if we have fast food, right, for most individuals, right, as their income goes up, they go out to eat more for fast food. But then at some point, right, they have so much wealth, they don't go to McDonald's anymore. They don't go to Pizza Hut anymore. They go to Ruth Chris's Steakhouse, right, or some other fancy restaurant. And thus, that's going to alter what our angle curve looks like, meaning that it starts to pivot backwards. But even though the angle curve is bending backwards, the demand curve, the demand curve is still going to be downward sloping, just as For an inferior good, the demand curve is still downward sloping. So, well, let me pause right here. So, when we shift the demand curve, or even just when we move along the demand curve, when we move along the demand curve, we're looking at what happens with a price change. So, what we know from our principles level class is that if the price of good X falls, that the quantity demanded of good X rises. And we can see that change right here. That changing the price of good X leads to the quantity changing. We want to understand this total change here. This total change is caused by these two things, the substitution effect and the income effect. So let's talk about each of these. The substitution effect is people buying more stuff. That when the price goes down, it's now cheaper relative to that other good. So they substitute towards that other good, relatively speaking. So these are not substitutes in terms of like oranges and tangerines or, um, you know, cars or SUVs, not substitutes where they have to meet the same needs. Rather, we're just talking about an individual with their overall budget substituting between goods based on their relative, meaning comparatively, their different prices. All while trying to keep their level of utility constant. Alternatively, we've got the income effect. And in the income effect, we're looking at people buying, as the price of a good goes down, I feel richer. I'm not actually richer, but I feel richer because now my income that hasn't changed can buy more of that good, relatively speaking. And so if I buy more of that good as my income goes, my buying power goes up. That would then be our income effect at work. And we can see that change here. So when it's a normal good, not entirely sure why they. Okay, well, let's go with what they got here. So in this graph here, they're saying that music is going up in price. Music tracks. Let's just call it MT. So as music tracks go up, again, what we know from the theory is that the quantity demanded of music tracks should be going down. Again, what this graph is going to show is it's going to show the substitution and income effects at work, presuming that music tracks are a normal good. So let's start first with the substitution effect. Again, this one is implying that I am shifting my buying towards a good because it's now cheaper, relatively speaking. So this curve right, so here are my two indifference curves, no drama about those, but this is my original budget constraint, this line right here, L1, this light blue line here. So my initial point of optimality here is E1. And to measure the substitution effect, what I do is I look at what my I look at what my new price ratio is going to be. The new price ratio is described by the slope of this L2, this darker blue line. But what I do is I now draw a line that's parallel to this new price ratio, because that would be that line would have that same slope, that same MRT. So what I do is I want to stay on the same indifference curve. But I want to have the new price ratio present. Because again, what I'm doing is I'm buying more of the good because it's cheaper, relatively speaking. Or in this case, it's more expensive, relatively speaking, which would mean you'd be buying less. So I draw this dashed line, which is exactly parallel to the new budget constraint. That would mean it has the new price ratio. And I'm going to draw it until it just touches the original indifference curve. Hence this point right here. And so the movement from E1 to E star is my substitution effect. Now, for the income effect, and I'll allow myself to be on the new budget constraint. So now what I do is I allow myself to be on this this new budget constraint line, and that change from E star to E2 is my income effect. Combined, it's the total effect, and that would be what we see collectively on the demand curve when the good is going up in price. So for the income effect, we allow ourselves to be on the new budget constraint. So here we're on the new budget constraint line. And we're on a new indifference curve. That's just going to be tangent to that original budget constraint. And so if we look at these problems here that are generated by it, if we look at a person that has apple pie and vanilla ice cream as perfect complements, then again, these indifference curves are going to be Leontief in shape, L-shaped. And we've got the price changing. It can create a situation like this, where again, we can imagine that the substitution effect fails to exist. It's highly unusual. Not sure why they're making an example of a highly unusual situation, but that's the authors for us. If I were making the textbook, what I would instead show for you is an inferior good. Only because I need the space on this slide. I think this is a dumb example. In an inferior good, the income effect works in the opposite direction of the substitution effect. But it's not large enough to overwhelm it. Which is why inferior goods still have downward sloping demand curves. And so we, in essence, can kind of see this in here. I'm not sure, again, why they're focusing on extreme examples here. Well, but here's our picture at least. Let's look at it, right? And so you could imagine here, you could imagine that you, despite this passion that some economists have over finding Giffen goods. A Giffen good would be one where the income effect is such an extreme inferior good that the income effect overwhelms the substitution effect. Let's look at just how this looks. So, for a Giffen good. So for a Giffen good, because we now know here that Perloff is one of those economists who loves his Giffen goods, wakes up in the morning looking for a good one. But these are situations where, um, again, let's start at E1. And in starting at E1, the good is becoming um, cheaper in price. So as the good becomes cheaper in price, we're going from L1 to L2. So the price of rice is going down. As a result, the budget constraint changes from L1 to L2, so it pivots outward. Or again, the substitution effect. We want the new price ratio, but we want the same indifference curve. So what I do is I draw a line that's exactly parallel, same slope as my new budget constraint, and I bring in that dashed line inwards until it just touches the original indifference curve at one point. That would be right here. So my substitution effect is taking me from E1 to E star. Then, for my income effect, I allow myself to be on the new budget constraint and a new indifference curve. And that is E2. So that would be E star to E2. But what we can see is that here we had our substitution effect. The income effect overwhelmed our substitution effect, so much so that there was a decline ultimately. What? Look at that violation of the law of demand. Oh my God, let's write lots of books and create graphs and torture undergraduates by talking about the Giffen good. Oh, please don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Um, but there you go. Okay. So one of the things that also then becomes important if we're talking about things from the perspective of um, uh, talking about this from a managerial standpoint, what becomes important as well is trying to calculate these compensating variations and these equivalent variations. What the compensating variation does for us is when the price goes up, how much money would I have to give people to offset that harm? This would be especially important if we were engaged in public policy, right? And I was looking at like rising energy prices or rising food prices. How much would I need to change, something like the minimum wage to overwhelm that effect? The equivalent variation, this would be is that if the equivalent variation would be is that if I didn't go through with the price increase, but I wanted to stop people from consuming the good as much, how much money would I have to take away from people for people just to voluntarily choose to buy less of it? This would become important, especially if I were trying to sell a good that had a pretty significant negative externality, like smoking, consuming sugary drinks, those kinds of things. Or, um, alternatively, when we're looking at the price of a good going up, what I can instead calculate are various inflation indices that change. Right, inflation, just as a reminder here, that as price levels are going up, how much how much is the adjustment in the inflation changing an individual's um, uh, purchasing power of their income, and then how much would I need to change their income to offset those rising prices? Our calculation of the real price. And the way that we did that, certainly in Principles of Macro, was um, we calculated the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, and in this calculation of the Consumer Price Index, we looked at a basket of goods and how much did that basket of goods cost over various years, and we calculated a um, a ratio, a ratio of those of that price basket, its value. And so, if I told you the CPI number for two different years, in this case for 2020 and for 1955, you could then multiply that ratio by the price of whatever that good was in 1955 to find out what it would cost, the equivalent good would cost in this case, in 2020. So, when would this math become useful? This math would become useful if you were the kind of person who was listening to your grandparents and they were talking about things where, gas used to cost, you know, this amount of money. Um, Candy used to cost this amount of money. And then you would calculate this for them and say, that's fine and dandy that it used to cost $1.46, or sorry, it's fine that it used to cost 15 cents, but the value of it today would be this much higher amount. Um, I don't know. This is kind of like the equivalent of me trying to remember what I used to pay for certain things. Like I remember a hamburger used to cost $1 at McDonald's, and I actually do. Some of my earliest memories of some prices is I remember when gas used to cost, I think, about 80 cents a gallon. And that would have been in the mid 80s, I think. So right, so we could calculate that relative CPI. Why don't we just do it? Why do we have to? I don't exactly remember that year that it was. So let's just pick it for the year 1987. Okay, so 111.8. Let's just say that again in 1987 that the price of gas was 80 cents. Okay. And that today the number is 308. Let's just keep it at 308. So then what we would say here is 308 over 112. Let's just do some simple rounding. Times 0.8 equals I would say that gas should be about $2.20 a gallon, at least in Wisconsin. Let's see what it costs in Wisconsin. Pick the biggest place that sells gas here. I'm gonna pick my old zip code. Which would be around the same location as where it was. And right now, gas is selling for $2.69. So gas is a little more expensive, relatively speaking, um, but not that much. So saying that gas used to cost 80 cents a gallon, its equivalent today would be about $2.20. But currently gas is about 260, so it's about 49 cents greater than what the inflation rate is. 49 cents, so that'd be about 20% more, relatively speaking, over that entire period of time. I don't know. That don't sound too bad to me. And so we would see these kinds of things here too. In terms of contracts that people sign, and what does that mean in terms of an individual's salary? Um, if you've taken me for principals in the recent past, you'll remember that one of the things I've complained about for my union that negotiates my wage increases is that we agreed to a wage increase that I felt was lower than what the expected inflation was going to be, which meant that my real income was going to be going down, um, relatively speaking. But how can we understand that graphically? Well, the way that we can understand that graphically would be that as the price of food um, changes, it changes my price. Well, in this case, my food is changing in price as well as my clothing is changing in price. So now both the goods on the X and the Y axis are changing. Looks like here food is becoming more expensive and food is becoming wait, sorry, that my clothing is becoming cheaper and that my food is becoming more sorry, I so many lines here. Okay, let me just take off my glasses here. Sorry. um, in this case here, that my uh, clothing is becoming more expensive. Now, how did I know that? Because my x intercept or my y intercept for clothing is getting closer to the origin. So my clothing is becoming more expensive, and my food is becoming cheaper because my x intercept now is farther from the origin. Okay, so if um, clothing is becoming more expensive, food is becoming cheaper, then what we would want to do is find out as we go from E1, our original optimal point, it looks like we're buying less clothing and more food, and that these consumers are essentially shifting from their budget being devoted more so to clothing and reshifting it a bit more towards food. And so, what that generates for us is it generates for us a legitimate question of how much would we need to change an individual's income to leave them just as well off in the second year as the first. So I would need to, in essence, raise their income levels by the cost of living index, that inflation index that we're working with here. The idea here being that right? If I don't want people to actually buy less of things, how much do I need to increase that income by? So as we look at it here, if my income level is 400 and I'm buying 200 units of food, 50 units of 50, generating 2,000 units of utility, um, and that the price of clothing is doubling and that the price of food is increasing by 25% here, um, if I didn't adjust their income, that same $400 income would lead me to buying less of both goods, generating a lot less utility. If I adjusted my income level by exactly the CPI, I would go from 400 to 650, but that would leave me actually better than I used to be before. So in other words, what I want is I want a level of increase that keeps me at the same level of utility rather than a something where my income is going by exactly up by that amount. So instead of going up to 650, the amount of the percentages, the weighted percentages of these price increases, I would only need to go to 632.50 to keep me at the same level of utility. And so we can kind of see that here of where I stay on my same level, on my same total indifference curve, rather than letting inflation leave me better off. That difference from 650 to 632.50, that difference has a name. And that name is the substitution bias. Is that when things are going up in price, we tend to substitute obviously a bit more towards a good that's not going up in price as much. And so in this case, it would mean that I'm substituting a little bit more um, towards food rather than clothing. Economists have spent a great deal of time since the late 90s doing their best to remove um, the substitution bias within goods. What we're also not taking into account is the choice that consumers make between labor and leisure. Here, what we've got going on is that instead of income being my constraint, what if it's that I want to spend a certain amount of time not working? This the time I spend not working has an opportunity cost. That opportunity cost would be how much earnings I give up by relaxing. And we can calculate that, right? And we can look at that in terms of my utility function. Well, my earned income is not going to go up when I spend time relaxing. My utility is going to go up because essentially, instead of buying goods and using those goods to make me happy, I'm going to just do nothing, right? I'm going to relax. And that relaxing is going to increase my utility. So, utility, one way to read that utility would be um, uh, me consuming it just like I would do any normal good, except now I don't have to spend money to do it. But my demand for leisure, yes, I face a time constraint of 24 hours in a day. But what's interesting is that what individuals tend to do, right, is that as their wage goes down, that would mean that the price of leisure goes down, right? Because the wage is my opportunity cost of leisure. That low income people, in some sense, have an incentive to enjoy leisure, and that as individuals get a higher and higher wage, they end up spending less and less time relaxing, less time for leisure. And we see that right here. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment here. And so what we see here is this exact same idea that as the wage changes, people change how much leisure they're both going to um, demand as well as supply. And that what we generally see is that people work more when their wage goes up. And then they're also not able to enjoy as much leisure. Um, this doesn't happen at all income levels, though, because what we can imagine is that you get to a point where you've had enough to, you've got enough, all of your needs are being met, and that eventually, um, at some point, you reach a point where um, you start to scale back your working activities so you can just kind of enjoy life. And that's the same kind of thing we see here, where in essence, an individual um, could start to get with a wage change. Um, we could see a situation where, again, the income effect overwhelms the substitution effect, and that the person actually consumes a bit more leisure as the wage goes up. So if you raise wages too much, people aren't going to necessarily work more. They might actually work less. And we can kind of see that with these kinds of applications here. Now, again, why is that important? Because if you're a manager and you're hiring people, this will tell you a bit more about, again, that the solution isn't necessarily just raise everyone's wages. You'll want to um, change wages so that you actually get some more leisure out of people, and then that people don't just relax more. Meaning that we see the situation where individuals change from the income being a normal good to a point where um, people uh, actually spend less time at work, as leisure, instead of being a normal good, can become a inferior good. That as your income is going up, you consume less work. And again, we're going to see this all a little bit more as we're looking at the actual problems here. I don't find these solved problems that useful, but we can kind of see this here. This would be, again, one consequence of what we're all learning in this chapter would be is that we could look at how things change when the minimum wage changes, and what does that mean for an individual's investment in work time. What we don't want to have is a situation um, where you're raising the wage so high that we go from E2 to E3. So this supply curve for labor is typically backwards bending. Economists have known this for some time, at least since the 1980s. Um, and so here you sometimes see politicians kind of complaining about this, like, have we raised wages so much that people are consuming more leisure? And the general idea is that we don't want them consuming that much leisure. We want to be operating more on segment E1 to E2 rather than E2 to E3 when we're raising the minimum wage. And the same idea with this, what happens when we change the income tax rate? Because in the end, at the end of the day, people don't care as much about. Um, People care less about what their wage level is, their raw wage level is. They care more about their take home pay. And so that's not always going to be the case. If I tax individuals too much, they're just going to work less because the wage itself is not enough to compensate them for their sacrificed leisure. And so you get this graph, which is called the Laffer curve, becomes the basis of Republican tax theory. And many Republicans and those who are kind of right thinking argue for the most part that our marginal tax rate is so high that if we were to increase taxes, people will work less, even more. Whereas Democrats and those who are left leaning think that most of the time we're over here, and that by reducing the marginal tax rate, you're just reducing overall tax revenue. We have this. I don't know why, to be honest. I'm not sure why we're debating this because this isn't too hard to measure. The data suggests that we actually are over here. I don't want this to be a lightning rod debate point here. I'm sure there's nuances to it. Why Republicans think we're here rather than here. I don't want to get into that debate, and honestly, I don't. Whether you're Democrat or Republican, I suspect that most people aren't actually even looking at the data. They're just going with the party that they've always gone with. So, I'm not sure even why I'm debating this very much. But I guess the most recent example we had of this was during the Trump administration when the tax rates, the marginal tax rates were reduced, tax revenue went down as well. Now, of course, there's one big qualifier that I should add to this. COVID also happened where people were working less because they were unemployed. And we can look at this instead of just taxes. The other thing would be is this kind of tax that parents have to pay in terms of sending their kid to childcare. And that childcare can be so expensive that people just choose to take care of their kid themselves at home rather than work. And we can kind of see that here. Okay.